because there is another Stephan Livera in Melbourne, actually.
Okay.
So,
Well, this one, at least according to Skype, it's Stephan.Livera and it's in Sydney. So maybe it's one of your
maybe
old ones.
it's an old one of mine.
We've probably all got a few old ones. How you doing?
Great, man. Yeah, just excited by all the stuff going on in Bitcoin, to be honest.
It's crazy, isn't it? What's capturing your attention the most?
So right now on my mind is how can we make it easy for people to run their own node, right? So I'm sort of doing things around that, and obviously like with the podcast and stuff, I'm thinking on like who can I get on the podcast to talk about some of these topics and stuff. So yeah, these are things that I'm thinking about right now, and I am looking at different options in terms of what I can teach, because I've got another business called Ministry of Nodes, right? So like podcast is my main thing, and then Ministry of Nodes is we're doing like an Australian Bitcoin education company. So we've run like some seminars and things. So yeah, a couple of things around that.
What's it like when you do the seminars? Like, what's the turn? I know you offer like a one-on-one thing as well, but is there lots of turnout, lots of interest? What's it like?
So we've only just gotten started, and to be honest with you, I think a lot of people don't really understand the importance of running their own full node yet. So they don't know why it's important. But if you were able to sit down with them and explain, I think a lot of them would get that.
Yeah.
But so far we've had like a session with kind of like a sort of like a high net worth / wealth advisory sort of team, but otherwise. We've also run a session. We just ran a session recently for basically just like individual hodlers, right? And so we had a small group and we did like a small classroom thing. So we're thinking about ways that we can try to maybe do web delivery and stuff like that. So so I guess a few different things around that I'm thinking about on how to structure that. And then, also just thinking about, obviously, interviews that I've got on and stuff. So I'm just doing a lot of the prep work and the admin alongside of that. So things like transcripts and like editing the transcripts and, just, I guess, admin stuff that relates to my podcast.
Sure. So, what do you say to someone, a noob or someone who's just kind of entered the space as the primary reasons for the importance of running a full node? Because sometimes it's hard enough just to make the value prop case for Bitcoin, but to kind of make them or inspire them to take the time to actually do that extra work. What are the kind of main like reasons that you give for them?
Yeah, so great question. And I think that's our fundamental challenge, is to explain to people, hey, what you've got. So most people, right, once they get any serious amount, or actually, even then, who knows, right? Some people leave it on the exchange, right? But the typical scenario, if you're talking people at a Bitcoin meetup, they might just have it on a Trezor or a Ledger, but not run a full node. Mm-hmm. And then, or if they are running a full node, they haven't connected that to their wallet. So then they're not like kind of verifying their own balance, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So I think I think of it like a progression level. So the way I would typically think of it, and I think this is a progression many people in the space go through themselves, so they can relate to it, right? They start by buying Bitcoin, leaving it on the exchange. Then next level is, okay, I should get a hardware wallet. Okay, and then the next level is run the node, and the next level is connect that, right? So I think in terms of how I'm kind of teaching people, and I sort of keep my finger on the pulse as well, because I'm often messaging my friends and I'm often, the guy teaching them, right? So I typically say get a cold card and get Wasabi wallet to start with. So don't worry about the node to start with, right? Just, stack your Bitcoins on the exchange and then pull it out into a cold card. Now, maybe that's blasphemy. There'll be some people out there who are like, no KYC ever. And I can, and again, that's another thing I've been thinking about as well, is like, how can people stack in a non-KYC fashion? Yeah. Because I think of it like we need a gamut. We need a full gamut of options. We need, there'll be obviously, the KYC exchanges of the world. There'll be, and, the BISC and HODL and fast Bitcoins on the other side. But anyway, so I think of it like that. And then I think the next step is trying to convey to people, how do you know that Trezor or Ledger or whoever else is not lying to you, right? I think that's probably the best way, because sometimes you have to drive that. People have to understand the risks, and sometimes you have to spell out what that is, and that is how you might be able to get through to them on, hey, actually, I need to take that next step. But I think that's the challenge, and I think, you know, even looking at myself and how I've improved the way I would teach people about Bitcoin over the years. I think I used to think people should just, I sort of expected too much out of people. I would just throw them a bunch of resources and expect them to pick it up and go with it. Now, over time, I'm starting to get more of a sense, like as I teach people, I see where they get stuck, where are the common sticking points, and you have to sort of understand what is the level they are at, technically and economically, and then say, okay, what is the next step for this person?
Absolutely.
Right? So you might give them, you know, so don't overwhelm them with resources. You'd say, okay, here's one episode, or here's one podcast to listen to, or here's one article, or here's one book. And you start like small and then sort of, you know, work the way up. And obviously some of them, they take it on their own, right? Like some people are very self-starter, right? And so once you give them even just one thing, and then like that it's about like flipping that switch. And once that switch is flipped, you're just like many of us.
You're in the rabbit hole.
Yeah, you're just like, oh, give me every possible thing I can. I need to like read more. I need to listen to every podcast. I need to like watch all these Andreas YouTubes or whatever. And it, you know, once you flip that switch, right? So, but part of it that then is once you're a more experienced Bitcoiner yourself, it's becoming how do you become a good teacher for the next person, right? Because this is, as I often say, there's no one coming to save us, right? It's us. We have to teach other people how to do this and how to do it the right way. Yeah. And so that's why I take such a strong focus about curation as well, and really trying to make sure I sort of guide people down the right pathway. And so that for me, with my podcast, I really tried to curate hard to make sure they were guests who really would bring a lot of value for my listeners, and I would try to, you know, drive the conversation in a way that educates them maximally as much as I can into the pathway of like, what is the ethos of Bitcoin? Why should you run your own full node? Why should you care about these things? Why, you know, etc.
Yeah, I think you've done an awesome job at that, man. And I think obviously the response from the community is often that you kind of, that curation is obvious, that you're intentionally kind of at every sequential level kind of providing people with the information needed to actually integrate or engage with those solutions and further enhance their Bitcoin mix, whatever that might be, whatever level they're at, you know. So I think, you know, you've done a tremendous job at that. And I get the, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about over the last couple of days is when you're deep into Bitcoin, right? Like you get into the conversations about, it becomes very adversarial, right? Bitcoin hodlers versus the state. This is what it's always about. And as you mentioned, you know, KYC is one of those ways that the state maintains their, you know, their eyes or their grip on you, as it were. And I get that from the adversarial perspective, and it would be ideal if you could be totally anonymous and totally untethered, no eyes on you, no way to kind of impose on you at all. But when we're talking about mass adoption, I mean, like if you bring out, like you were saying at the beginning, like Bitcoin is it's digital gold, blah, 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 internet money, programmable money. And also you want to make sure that the state has no idea you're involved in this. It's like, whoa, like I'm down for sounder money, and I get, you know, that inflation is a hidden tax and all that, but like I don't want to be, I'm not trying to be an outlaw or a criminal here, right? Like I don't want to do something where I have to maintain my anonymity. So, you know, and this comes up a lot when people talk about OPSEC and stuff too. And obviously as a public podcaster and a public figure, I mean, you've accepted that people are going to know that you're into Bitcoin, right? But so many people, whether it's anonymous Twitter accounts or, you know, they'd rather hide that. And I'm just thinking, like, if this is going to be mainstream, you know, we're all going to have to say that, like, we're involved in this in some capacity. We can't expect mainstream adoption when we're not even willing ourselves to come out of the closet. You know?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And look, I think ultimately that, like I said, with the gamut, right? There'll be some people who, right, part of it was I said, hey, fine, I'll take it on myself. I'll put my name and my face, my real name, my real face out there so that more mainstream people can like see a name and a face to like follow. But I totally appreciate that for some people, if they want to go pseudonym the whole way, you know, they can do that. But yeah, you're right. I think part of it though is I think people don't appreciate the need for their own privacy and their own security until, to some extent, it's too late, right? Like until you've already doxed yourself, and now you're like, oh, you know, right? So whereas for me, it was more like, you know what, I'm just going to take it on myself, because I just felt like at the time there wasn't a lot of, it was just the blind leading the blind. There was just too much nonsense out there. So that was part of it for me. But I think to your point, though, about how do you make it mainstream, how do you actually really get there? Look, I think the reality is a lot of people will use KYC on ramps to Bitcoin, right? It's not controversial to say that, right? I think a lot of people will do so. But I think my hope is that for the people who really, really want to, they can still go no KYC, and crucial to that is having the right infrastructure around that. So, for example, that's having BTC Pay Server, and you can earn Bitcoins, and having other ways to try and buy and sell Bitcoins without necessarily going that route. But not everyone has to go that way, So, and I think that's ultimately the message, because, like you said, not everyone is going to be like ready to kind of be like, yeah, I'm going to go full crazy anon, everything, super private. Not everyone is at that level. I'm certainly not at the level that I could be like super anon private. Like I'm higher technical competence than the average, person, but I'm not like some super, good computer person. So that's definitely an angle. I think it just comes back to having options.
Right. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned some great initiatives there, like BTC Pay Server and stuff. And actually, when you were saying it, it made me think of, because people are considerate of KYC considerations, because one of the ways in which the states, each individual state could attack this is not necessarily on the protocol level, but on the privacy level. So they could say, we know that you purchase Bitcoin on Coinbase, and, we want you to burn it, sell it back to us, get rid of it, or else, or else we throw you in a cage or something like that. And that is definitely a concern, but kind of similar to the gun debate that's ongoing these days is that, these technical solutions are kind of going to make regulations almost unenforceable or irrelevant. Like if everybody can print a gun in their own home, how are you actually going to, restrict the use or control or enforce those regulations? So I guess my hope is that it gets to that extent where it's so dispersed and distributed, and it's so easy to engage in that, enforcing laws, especially on that scale, would be very, very difficult.
Right. One more point I was actually keen to add there. I think the other part about not KYCing and stuff, like some people, and I think it's a fair point that they make, it's that it's not just the government like coming after you for tax and whatever, it's that it's another whole company who know your balance. Right. And if there's a rogue employee at that company, they know, oh, John's balance is this many, or it represents a honeypot, the honeypot argument of, hey, if that company got hacked, their database of customers, and maybe right? And for example, with the Block, right? So the Block recently, there was that drama about how they had really poor security and they didn't respond well to somebody who came to them with basically, he was like a white hat hacker. He came to them and said, hey, look, I found some problems. You guys should fix that up, right? And I think the Block didn't really respond that well on this point. And the other thing there is, if somebody were to exploit that maliciously, they would then have access to the Block's subscription list. And guess what? All these people, they probably have a lot of Bitcoin, right? So it's kind of like, these are things that companies have to be so careful about now, because again, these honeypot, they can become like a honeypot, right? And I guess we all face this, right? Because anyone who runs a company, like, it's like, you want to do the best to protect your customers, but I think KYC, I mean, obviously I have big, strong feelings about how bad AML laws are, right? Like, I just think it makes us all worse off. It makes us all puts us all into so much more danger, especially in this kind of new Bitcoin world where Bitcoin is a bearer asset, and once it's gone, there are no bailouts. So, it creates a lot of risk, systemic kind of risk for all of us. Even if you take away the whole kind of government coming after you for taxation angle as well. Yeah,
I agree with that. How does, like, those regulations, are they, because I know Austrian economics is, one of your specialties, area of interest, education. Are such things even ever discussed in the Austrian sense? Was it before that time, like AML, KYC, does that even come up?
Well, the AML KYC stuff, I don't think ever came up into some of the mainstream Austrian texts, but there is discussion on that. So Per Byland, for example, I think he's got some good work on this. But I think the general point we would make is generally that, for the most part, people enter into trades or agreements when they voluntarily agree to do so. What happens, though, is that a government may mandate a certain interaction or mandate a certain way of doing things, and that, like, typically it's like they're kind of just, okay, there's a lot of different arguments you can make here. I think one of the key ones is that fundamentally consumer regulation is better than kind of government regulation, because oftentimes it's like that idea of the regulator gets captured, or it becomes too much of a one size fits all, as opposed to where consumers regulate things in that sense, where you might have a market rating agency, you might have voluntary agreements between different players in the industry about how they're going to do a certain standard, how they're going to do a certain thing. And what I sense and what I see is that oftentimes things start to become better because like the market started to make it better, and then the government just sort of jumps in and then like mandates a law about it, and then sort of pretends like that was the source of the improved productivity or growth, right? A quick example would be even workplace safety and health laws, right? So over time, right, especially with many competing firms competing for your labor, one of the aspects on which they'll compete for that labor is safety, right? So naturally, there's a competition there to make it safer and safer for workers. Yep. But what happens, I think, is that governments will sort of see a certain standard and then mandate that standard for everybody. And it becomes the equivalent of saying, oh, hey, if you can't afford a Hyundai car, we want everyone should have Mercedes level, right? And it's like, well, hang on, not everyone can afford that, right?
Yeah.
So do you see the point I'm trying to make there? Is that like people,
yeah. You know, it makes me think of just the general behavior of government and expectation for government behavior by such a large portion of people today, in that, you know, a perceived problem arises, and then the government is only too happy to pluck out the most basic, simple solution and just shove it on top of that problem. You know, one that comes to mind when you were just discussing that is, you know, I saw Bernie Sanders put out a video about quote unquote patriotic capitalists talking about increasing the minimum wage, right? And it's framed as in people are suffering. You know, there's a lot of people that don't have enough money. We need to increase the minimum wage, and that will fix it. And you know, you're watching it. I'm watching it in disbelief that anybody can think the problem is just solved by people don't have enough money. Well, let's give people more money. Problem solved. And it's politically expedient. And the people that are suffering, you know, of course, they're not going to say, yeah, I don't want any more money. But as I know that you know from your education, like, that is obviously a far oversimplified solution. The only way in which I sympathize with people that espouse that kind of stuff, and actually that's the wrong word, because I totally don't. I think it's entirely misguided. But at this stage in the system that we have globally of politics and financial system, monetary standard, like, it's not like you could just insert the right decision on one, on one level now, because it's perverted on both ends by everything below it and everything above it. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, it's really hard to just, you know, do what's rational and reasonable in the system now, because it's predicated on such, you know, it's poorly established, you know, the foundations of it.
Right. I see what you're saying. I think the way to think of that is, you know, it may be that there are multiple different interventions, and if you merely remove one of them out, it kind of leaves, like, it's still kind of, but ultimately Bitcoin fixes this, man. Like, we're gonna opt out. We're gonna build our own parallel financial system, and I think more and more people are getting into that now. Whereas I think years ago it was more like, just everyone's just gambling and whatever, and people are trading. Now I think there's really a resurgence in that idea of, hey, I'm just going to stack sats. I'm just going to do my thing and do the best that we can to sort of opt out, right? I think it's again, not everyone's a libertarian, right? But there's this guy, the late Harry Brown, rather, and he wrote this book about how to live free in an unfree world, and it was sort of like that. It's sort of Bitcoin is just like that in some ways. That like we're living in an unfree world. What's the best way that we can try to live free in that unfree world? Well, it's by focusing on on these things that we can do.
Right.
You know, on Bitcoin, learning about, you know, like at least from the perspective that I take, is that the more I can try and learn and also teach about Austrian economics and about Bitcoin's technology, the better off we will be in, you know, 5 to 10 years. Those people who spend time now building a competence in these areas, they will be better placed and better positioned for this coming decade or two, right? Because we are bullish on Bitcoin fundamentally. Like, we think this thing is going millions of dollars per coin, right? That would be a low end estimate in my view.
Right.
So I think for us, it's about how do you best kind of help new people into that system if they would like to join us, and then the rest of us, we're just trying to do, like, I think ultimately people are in a competition to try and stack as many sats as they can, right? And that's sort of we're almost in a competition with each other, but at the same time we sort of, you know, it's like a friendly competition.
We definitely are. But it's like, yeah, it's friendly competition. You know, like we both have the same goal in mind, but it's not adversarial to the point you want one to win and one to lose. You're just like, you know, let's get after this to the extent that we can, and we'll meet each other in the Citadel. You know, sort of thing.
I'll see you in the Citadels, right? As I say.
Yeah, but I have to say, I know we keep ourselves in our own bubbles. You know, there is an entire world that doesn't know anything about this stuff. But as you say, I mean, it does seem, it's just so cool that so many people are starting to think about these things, are asking questions about what money is and how society should be structured and how economics should work, and how, you know, it's a real revolution because, you know, as you said, all we can do is focus on, you know, the things that interest us and the things from which we derive meaning, and put our energy and resources behind that and try to make something of it. And that's always been the case. But as you said, we're free, you know, trying to be free people living in an unfree world. And I think part of the enthusiasm that Bitcoin inspires is that many of us, if we had a good head on our shoulders, we were doing that 10 years ago, right? Like, okay, the world's kind of fucked up, but I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to carve out my niche here, focus on my family, friends, the work that I like. But this kind of overarching, like, it's all kind of fucked, isn't it? Like, cloud would be hanging over it. And I think, you know, I've said this maybe too much now, but Bitcoin has brought this illuminating force to that, you know, kind of to continue the analogy, like the sun parting the clouds, where not only are you relegated to only carving out a niche of happiness for yourself, but now you realize that it could actually, the whole thing could turn into that. And it just inspires you more and more to put more effort and energy behind that. And I'm sure you're inspired by that as well, you know, in all the things that you do.
For sure.
It's just incredible.
I mean, for me, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you what, like, again, not everyone's a libertarian, so not everyone's going to, like, resonate with this story. But for me, I was often trying to teach people about libertarianism, right, before I kind of got into Bitcoin. But I sensed that, okay, yeah, there were a few people I managed to help, you know, sort of bring into the fold in terms of thinking about libertarian ideas. But ultimately, it was a very small number.
Yeah.
But when I saw Bitcoin and when I properly, like, read about it and understood what it could actually achieve, that was when I got in short, I had a lot more hope, right? I had a lot more hope about what it could actually achieve.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it gave me fundamentally. And I think that's kind of this message. And even for the people who are not necessarily libertarians, most people, at least if you're in Bitcoin, you appreciate the need for separating money from state, right?
Yeah.
Like, whatever your other positions on other things about, you know, gun control and eating meat and, you know, whatever, right? Like, fundamentally, the key thing is about separating money from state. That's really the message, and that for me is what I'm mostly driving in terms of why do we need to do that? How can we best achieve that? How can you best secure yourself while you're on this mission or on this journey with everyone else? While we're competing with each other, but we're also friendly with each other in how to do this.
Sure. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with competition. Back to that. I mean, I like to I do a lot of Thai boxing, and you good mate, you get in the ring, you compete against each other to improve yourselves. Ultimately, that's why you're there, and then you shake hands at the end, and it's all good. But yeah, the whole behavior change aspect of this phenomenon is really another phenomenon on top of it. Yes, separating money and state is something that many of us have recognized for a long time would be extremely beneficial for humanity, but just the fact that we're seeing, people. I actually just did an interview with Robert Breedlove, and basically he said the same thing, in that it's kind of drawing a higher, I hate to use that word, but a better, higher, more optimal version of ourselves from ourselves. And I don't know if that's because of the hope element or the excitement and the enthusiasm or the sovereignty and independence, probably a collection of them all, but like we're seeing a revolution in like behavior change as well as financial change.
Absolutely. So this is like the whole time preference point as well, right? It's that whole point around how people start to really think more about their future. I personally, even from a younger age, I was relatively a bit more of a saver type. Like I would like to save my money kind of thing. But I've noticed a lot of other people who necessarily were not like that. And they were a bit more of the consume now type. And they've really changed their behavior. A lot of them have really started to think more deeply about, what am I earning? What am I spending? How can I, cut my expenses a little bit so that I can save more and then stack more sats, right? And I think that's a really good behavior. And I think it's not clear to people because people from the outside world, like people who aren't sort of in this world like us, they would look on that and think, what? You Bitcoiners think Bitcoin fixes everything? No, it doesn't fix everything. You're ascribing way too much to this one thing. How can you say that, inflation is so bad and inflation drives all these negative cultural consequences and so on? But from our point of view, no, it really does. It really changes it changes your behavior, and it changes the society's behavior as well. Yeah. Because if the government can just bail people out and it can just costlessly print up the money, and the government doesn't have that control, that it doesn't have that check presented on it that gold used to be. Gold used to check the government's size, and that drifted away obviously because of political vulnerability reasons and centralization of gold. And so essentially, that all comes back to where we believe and where we have hope that Bitcoin changes that game, because it just changes the calculus of that violence. It just is the game changer.
Yeah, and I think the fact that Bitcoin fixes this is so applicable to so many things. And like you said, some people, obviously they don't see it yet, but I think that's a direct result of the fact that the reality that we experience, the way we engage in the world as a society, as economically communicating individuals, the primary mechanism on which that is built is the money. And so if you improve or change that change or improvement is going to be reflected in damn near everything. And so that's where the meme comes from, is because it's a recognition of how fundamental the money is to human culture and society. And so if you change it, if you upgrade it, you're gonna get a better version of the existing things that you have in society. So it does fix this.
Yeah, I like the way you framed it there. It's so you can think of it like, upgrade your money, upgrade your society, right? Yeah. Like we're gonna make the world a better place. And I think that may sound a little crazy to people, again, outside of this world, but I really believe it. I really do believe we upgrade our money, we're going to upgrade our society, and we're going to live in a better world. And that is fundamentally, we're just going to wipe away a lot of that malinvestment and a lot of that waste. A lot of the warfare and welfare state can be washed away, and we can spend that time productively, spend those resources productively. And, we'll still have some of these, services done, right? Like we'll have police and courts and so on, but they'll be done in a much more efficient way. They'll be done in a way that's appropriate to that community. And that each community will sort of have more control and more say in what happens to them. You look at what's happening in Hong Kong, right? This whole community, literally the population of Hong Kong is like 7 million, and they had something like 2.5 million turn up to one of the protests, right? And they've got all these people who are protesting because they don't want one country, one system. They wanted one country, two systems. And they were fundamentally sold a lie, because the Chinese government doesn't care about them and is now basically kind of heavy-handedly bullying them. And I think it's another example. Now, there was recently that little story of how the local Bitcoin's volume in Hong Kong was shooting up. Now, in fairness, that was not a huge amount, right? It's not a globally significant thing or anything, right? But I think it's foreboding. It's a thing of something to come, right? We're seeing the tremors already of, hey, people are starting to see there's something to this Bitcoin thing, and we're still tiny today, right? I think the people today are the people who are typically a bit more intelligent, people who are typically have some level of interdisciplinary knowledge, right? They can't just be good at economics. They can't just be good at technology. They sort of have to have a little bit of each, right? And that's being assisted now with resources like the Bitcoin Standard and, the Bitcoin Twitter gang and all the people like writing good articles and so on. And that's helping bring the education. But I still think for now, it's not something that as much as I wish we could make it simpler, it's just right now we're not able to really communicate well with people who aren't like it's pretty much we're able to speak to people kind of a higher intelligence and more patience. It's kind of difficult to kind of sell that message right now, but I think it will come around, and it'll come around with celebrities coming in, and then people who just follow that celebrity will just do it, right? Like this whole Michelle Phan thing. I think that's really interesting as well, right?
Yeah, I agree, and because basically what you're talking about is adoption. When will people start looking at it? When will they see it? And on the one hand, I've said this before, and I think other people have said it as well, but like Bitcoin is a wealth transfer to the curious. If you look out on the world and instead of just accepting it, you look and say, why is that way? Why is that way? This could be better, that could be better. Then you're naturally eventually going to fall on it because it's one of the fundamental, things that could be improved, and it's so fundamental to the operation of our lives and society. So if you have that curiosity, you'll get there. And the other thing is look at how the space has changed in the course of the last 2 years. Even if like Twitter is your only metric, look how many more like anonymous accounts and like, gag accounts are there just being like your taco pleb on Twitter and engaging in the community. Like it's happening. And maybe it's not a rush right now. Maybe it's a steady stream, but it's filling up. And then as you said, you've got various celebrities from different sections of media and life and sports and stuff that are coming in. And for a lot of people, as we know, it's going to be a necessity thing. They won't really take the time because everyone's busy with their own lives. They're not going to take the time until they see a need for it. Like, damn, I got to protect my wealth, or damn, the state is being too overbearing. I got to have some of my assets outside of that. But it brings to mind a quote from The Matrix, which I'm sure we all, as Bitcoiners, love the analogies and metaphors in that movie. But I think it's in the second one, or maybe it's the first one. I can't remember. But the Oracle says, we're all here to do what we're all here to do. Because sometimes I wonder, like, should I be promoting adoption? Like, first of all, does it have any impact? Maybe a tiny bit, but like, should we not just let it happen naturally? And I think the answer is like, well, what do you derive meaning from? What do you enjoy doing? If you enjoy having these conversations, talking to people, enhancing your own knowledge and information and sharing it with others, then go ahead and do it. And, don't have too much expectation on like what your specific impact might be. If it feels right to you and if you enjoy it, then maybe it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it's a good point you make, because fundamentally it is a time factor. It's not necessarily just about having good education and
or good
so on.
UX or whatever. Like,
yeah, exactly. I think it's like on the margin we can help it, right? Like I think it's on the whole it's kind of just going to play out as it plays out. But on the margin, I think a skillful communicator can kind of influence it in certain directions. And because I guess there's conflicting ideas in my mind here at this point, because you could say, hey, there's that saying, the best way to predict the future is to create it, right? And so if you want Bitcoin to evolve in a certain way, in a certain ethos that, don't trust, verify, like that kind of ethos, then maybe you do need to help push it in that direction and be one of those voices who's out there helping drive it in that direction. Or otherwise, maybe your worry is that it ends up in a custodial future and then Bitcoin becomes centralized, and who knows. But there's different arguments you can make on that. Maybe you could say it's an individual risk. Those people who trust the institution, they're the ones who'll get wrecked, right? And the people who run their own node, hold their own keys, etc., they will be fine. They will be untouched by the collapses of these fractional reserve banks or whatever, if they were to be. The other angle, though, is to take a more sort of dispassionate view, right? If you were even like sometimes if you wanted to sort of be a more dispassionate economist looking at the way, and you're just trying to understand and explain, right? And you're thinking of it like, hey, this is a phenomenon. I'm trying to understand and explain this phenomenon. I'm not necessarily like out there advocating for it. But I mean, for me personally, I sort of more am a little bit more on the advocate side, obviously. But I think that's totally fine to take that position of sort of more dispassionate, assessing what happens and sort of explaining the story of what unfolds, or helping to try and clarify that for people to some extent. Different views there.
I agree, and different personalities will go off in those two or several directions, and that's the way it should be, right? And those who are attracted to one approach versus another will naturally gravitate towards them, And I've been talking about this a little bit lately, but so many people are so hopeful about Bitcoin, but there's this like reservation to express the full enthusiasm, because nobody wants to come off as the crazy person coming down from the mountain. And, we all have had those conversations in public that are challenging, even if we're, very deliberate and calm about them. But I do think it's important to show enthusiasm, because it's infectious. It doesn't mean you have to be irrational, but, I don't know. I think people respond to emotion far more than they do to reason and logic most of the time. And if you can combine those in in the right way, where you're still logical, you're still reasonable, you're still rational, but you're just letting the people who are observing you feel your enthusiasm for it. Like I like that. I think I'll probably in my engagements in the future be more enthusiastic, because it's real, I'm being more conservative intentionally if I'm not showing my enthusiasm.
Right. I see what you're saying there. Totally. I think definitely for me, I think people sense that as well. They sense I've just got this natural kind of like, I'm just really like, I just have a passion for it. And I think that resonates with people. Right.
Yeah.
But to your point about emotions versus logic, that reminds me of this book by Jonathan Haidt. I've forgotten the exact name. I think can't remember the exact name, but the basic concept is like your brain is like this elephant. It's like the elephant and the rider. And the elephant is the emotional part of your brain, and then the rider is like the rational part of your brain. And then what happens in practice is that your elephant is really what's making decisions on things, and then your rider is kind of post facto justifying what decision got made. Yeah. So you're right in the sense that we are more emotionally swayed, and actually much more emotionally swayed than we would like to admit. We'd like to think that we're very rational and logical about how we think about things, but actually that's not really the case.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. When I did a podcast with American Hodl, he used that exact example too, right? How there was some testing done where like the response was recorded prior to like the stated or logical response, and just that we have the emotional response, and then our conscious mind justifies whatever that response was, right? And we think we made like a rational, logical decision, but most often we're probably swayed by emotions. You mentioned libertarian, right? So I think you call yourself a libertarian, and I had a conversation lengthy with Eric Voskuil a couple of days ago, and he's an anarchist, and I asked him what the distinction was, and he basically said, well, libertarianism, for all its divergences from other political philosophies, still believes in a state, versus anarchy, which doesn't.
Different definition. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask you if you could elaborate on kind of what your definition of libertarianism is.
So yeah, I would classify myself as an anarcho-capitalist libertarian. For me, libertarianism is like a overarching philosophy, and then there are kind of what's the best way to say it? Like subcategories within that, right? So within libertarianism, you've got a gamut again. So you've got some from the anarcho-capitalist area who believe in no state, and then you've got some who are minarchist, right? And so from my point of view, I just think of all of that is libertarianism, and then not every libertarian is an anarcho-capitalist. So that's how I would frame that particular point. And so within the, I guess, broad church of libertarianism, if you will, the range would be basically people, to the right of people who are only just slightly to the right of, say, the Republicans, right? And then you've got like the people who just want the smallest possible state, right? So I think a good example I've mentioned on a podcast before is Francis Pouliot, right? So he's a minarchist. He believes in the idea of typically the minarchist state is courts, police, and national defense, and that's it. Nothing else done by the government. Whereas the anarcho-capitalist is more like literally everything done by the free market, courts and everything. Now, to the point of, do you go and debate each other and say, no, we should have no state versus we should have a small state? Like, for me, I don't bother getting into that argument, really. Like, for me, yeah, like, while I think zero government and, fully private governance would be best, I don't know if it'll ever happen in my lifetime, and I don't know if it's if it's really worth fighting about it, right? Because we've got bigger fish to fry, right? Like that's why I don't really, debate that so strongly myself. Although in years gone by, there were a lot of libertarian debates and kind of infighting around those sorts of points, right? So, some people would be hating on Ron Paul because he wasn't putting out a fully, perfectly anarcho-capitalist position, but I think there's only so much you can do if you're trying to run for president, right?
Sure.
So
you got, especially in that context, you've got to make trade-offs if you're going to be, viable at all. But I just think that the money dictates, the type of social organization we get, and if you use a money with a lot of detrimental attributes, then you'll have to erect structures around that will ultimately represent, a concentration of power, and that will be co-opted over time. Versus if you use a money that has far fewer detrimental attributes, then you won't need as many structures layered on top of it to coordinate social function, and there won't be as many opportunities to co-opt power. It's pretty simple. Like I don't get too bogged down in these philosophical conceptual ideas of what the state should or shouldn't be. Is the money you use will dictate the state if you allow it, and it will be predicated on the attributes or lack thereof of the money. And again, that's why I'm hugely interested in Bitcoin, is because gold was great, but it had a number of detrimental attributes, and as a result we still had to erect structures over top of it to make it usable. Bitcoin has far fewer. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, and its imperfections will probably come more to light as time goes on, and our kind of rampant enthusiasm becomes a little bit more reserved. But man, I think if we could get that money in use by the world, then whatever government structure emerges around that, which probably we don't even have a name for it at this time, would be the best that we could hope for.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think fundamentally, as much as I might want an anarcho-capitalist society, I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime. The likely outcome, in my view, is city-states, right? We're going to see a world with, Singapore, thousands and thousands of, Singapores and Hong Kongs and Liechtensteins and places like Switzerland. And I think on net, that'll be much better. That'll be a lot better than what we have today. So
well, that'd be cool.
Let's take it. I'll take that, right?
They'd be competing for us to live there, right? And presumably they'd be competing on services, and that everybody benefits from that.
Exactly.
What I was going to ask, though, kind of related to that, is I don't know how much of a history buff you are, but are there any examples of what would be the example of the most libertarian or anarcho-capitalist state in history? Do you know much about that?
So there's a couple of pieces on this. I think there's one by a libertarian named Roderick Long. So he's written a little bit about this idea of I think it was in Iceland, and I'm not as up on these examples, whereas years ago I knew them off the top of my head. But that's one example where there were chieftains, and the idea was that you could be living in a certain area but have different chieftains, and your chieftain sort of was your kind of like your legal, almost like a legal representative or protector as well, and you kind of voluntarily paid for services, but it wasn't whereas government, we think of that as a territorial monopolist and ultimate authority of the land, right, in terms of law and taxation, right? Whereas this idea was more like you could be here and choose different chieftains and stuff, and so that was somewhat like that idea. And there are other examples as well. So books on this, there's one called Private Governance by Edward Stringham, and they talk about some different examples of, So I mean, there's a few different examples. So there's Private Governance by Edward Stringham. There's this one called, I think it's called Anarchy and the Law by Peter Leeson. There's another one called The Enterprise of Law by Bruce Benson. So there's a bunch of these ideas, and they'll talk about some of these systems that even like gangs had, and some of these like the law amongst pirates, and like how there were certain rules of the game, right? And they would still act by that code, and even though they were pirates, right? Which you would think like, oh, they would just like kill and rape and do whatever, right? But really, that wasn't actually how it happened. Now, in terms of more modern day examples, yeah, like we don't have a perfect anarcho-capitalism idea, right? So we typically just look at, well, what are the places that are more capitalist, right? So, the places like Hong Kong, when it's not being taken over by China, is a good example. Switzerland is a good example. Liechtenstein is a good example. So those are some of the good examples, but it would be a fair criticism for people to say, hey, that's never existed before. But I think ultimately for us, it comes back to also like what is the right moral foundation, right? And so the libertarian way of framing that question is typically it's immoral to initiate aggression against somebody to basically steal their stuff or steal their property or against their person. And so if you really truly respect that, then you want to try and think about what society should look like. And part of that is why we believe taxation is not right, because it wouldn't be right if it was done by a random individual, right? Like if I just took it on myself to go down the street and like go gun to the head to everyone and say, hey, pay me because I'm doing police services for all of you, they would say, hang on, Stephan, we didn't ask you to do this. Why are you doing this? Why do you think who gives you the right? Right? And so I think fundamentally we would say it's that the fact that people vote on it doesn't really make it right? Just because, two wolves and a sheep vote on who's for lunch doesn't, right? That's the saying goes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's very like kind of specifically around libertarian political philosophy and theory. Obviously I am a libertarian, but I don't necessarily bring that up on my own podcast, so to speak. I sort of focus on the economics and the technology components of it, but I guess in the back of my mind, it is there in terms of how I'm thinking about things. And to some extent, I think that's why when you look at guys like Trace Mayer and stuff, like who's like super early, I think one of his focuses, if anything, when he was sort of in the earlier days, was which communities would be best placed to hold Bitcoin early. And I think he wanted more other libertarian types to be early Bitcoiners so that they could help form the rest of the new society under a way that was more amenable to a private property ethic, to this idea of, hey, we're going to live under a society with actual free market laws, not just like the government makes up the law and the government chooses winners and does regulation and does all these government programs.
Yeah. I understand and agree with what you said. And, like I said, I just think money is what dictates our behavior. And improve the money, improve the behavior, and the proper way to organize around that will naturally coalesce. So I think, which is to say, we're probably doing the right thing in focusing on the money now, and not so much getting stuck in the quagmire of philosophical or political debates. Just saying
exactly.
We need to focus all of our energy because we know how primary this thing is, and we'll encounter the rest of it once we cross a few more hurdles.
Yeah.
What's it been like for you, man? I know that you've been doing the podcast a little over a year now. I heard you say you stepped away from other work in May or June of this year, right?
Yeah. So I quit my normal job start of June-ish. And so we're talking 3-4 months now, or maybe a little bit more. But
what's it been like?
Basically. Yeah, I mean, it's totally different. I mean, I'm basically...
liberating, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that was the first part. And, I mean, for me, I'm just sort of thinking about ways that I can really scale this and really make it sustainable, right? So now, I'm getting like advertisers on the podcast, and I'm, building this other business as well, which is about Bitcoin education. So yeah, but it's definitely much more liberating in the sense that I set my own hours, right? And it's like that saying, I'd rather work 12 hours a day for myself than 8 hours a day for someone else.
Right.
So that sort of thing. So to some extent, that has come into my mind as well. That I probably spend more time working, but I'm doing stuff I'm passionate about, and so that for me is just amazing.
Well, you just get to access that wellspring of additional energy, right? Like I think everybody can relate to the fact that if you're walking into a job that even if you only partially dislike, then it's it's kind of you come home at the end of the day and you're tired. You don't have much excess energy. But like you just said, maybe you do 12, 14-hour days at this, but because of what it represents and because you're in control and because of the way you feel about it, you probably you probably like doing it actually. You're probably, pretty excited to get going every day.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think it's like that thing of how we feel like we need a purpose, right? And we need something that we're working on. And for me, I guess Bitcoin advocacy, Bitcoin education has become a bit of a purpose of mine. And so I'm very happy to spend time doing that. And it just ultimately is about how fulfilling and, rewarding it is. And I get a big sense of reward out of doing the stuff I'm doing. So, I absolutely very... I thank my lucky stars that I got into a position that, I can do this now. So, I'm just very lucky.
Well, you're doing the Lord's work for sure. But I think you partially answered this, but is your kind of idea of what your plans are for the next couple of years just more of this? I'm sure it'll evolve and change as you think up of innovative ideas about how to actually execute it. But for you, it's just more in terms of execution and outreach education, outreach, that kind of stuff?
Ultimately, yes. I think I want to look at how I can make things better and ultimately just craft better and better educational stuff for people on Bitcoin, obviously. So I think the podcast, I just put out just a ton of material out there. I'm thinking of ways that I can structure it. You might have noticed I've done some series recently. So I had like a BTC Pay Server series, a hardware wallet series, Bitcoin custody series. So I've tried a few different, I've tried a few things like that to try and give people almost like a little curriculum, right? It's like, hey, you want to learn about this thing? Here's the series. Just binge through that series and you're good. So I've tried to think about little things like that, as well as what are some other things I could do around maybe writing articles. And I've got in the back of my mind, I'm like, I should write a book, hey. So I'm thinking about that as well. But
what would the book be about, out of curiosity?
Well, I haven't thought too much about it yet. So I've got a few different ideas, right? It might be something related to Austrian economics. It might be something like, something related to how, Bitcoin is a way of us getting freedom, right? And it's a way of us kind of contributing in some sense to this, Bitcoin nation, if you will, around the world, right? Like I'm here in Sydney and there's people all over the world. In fact, only probably 5% of my listeners are in Australia, right? Which is funny when you think about it, right? I'm an Australian podcaster, but 95% of my audience is overseas.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Oh no, yeah. Go on.
I was just gonna say, what made you decide to, fire up a podcast in the first place? And not only decide, but allow yourself the latitude to say, like, people would give a fuck about what I have to say about anything, because that can be a stumbling block for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's right. For me, it was frustration, right? I was getting frustrated with the quality of not everything, but there were very few really high quality resources out there at the time that I started, right? Because I just felt like it was the blind leading the blind, right? So a lot of these podcasters were just getting on random, shitcoiners and blockchainers, and it just wasn't what I wanted, right? And to some extent, and this is sort of similar to open source as well, people scratch their own itch, right? So to some extent, when I'm doing podcasts, I'm crafting it in such a way that if I was a listener and I wasn't a podcaster myself, what would I want to listen to? Well, that to some extent, that's one thing I'm doing in terms of how I structure and how I think about, okay, who would be a good guest? What would be some good topics? How should I run this interview? That's kind of one thing. And also I just fundamentally thought people are thinking about it the wrong way. And I think now we've got a swing back, the pendulum sort of swinging back in terms of people coming from more what I call Bitcoin Austrian view, right? So, so my friends like Safedine and Pierre Richard, Michael Goldstein, VJ, some of these guys like, Marty Bent, Matt Odell, like we're sort of pushing it back to being more about Bitcoin and Austrian economics. And so that for me was, what can I do to help people see it in a clearer light? And I think I've, been, to some extent I've got lucky, right? Like part of it was just right place, right time. I think I was just doing something that other people weren't doing at the time.
Did you think it would turn into a career opportunity, or were you just like, I feel like doing this, so I'm going to do it?
Yeah, I think it was definitely, I just wanted to do it, right? I just thought, for me, it was like, I'm throwing caution to the wind. I'm just going to do it. It was just a passion, For me, now it is my full-time job, but back then it was, I spent a lot of time, right? I basically spent almost all my time outside of work working on episodes and like hustling to get guests on and hustling to, go and research and make sure that the episode was really tight in terms of good questions to ask and good topics to cover so that it would be a very good pathway for a new person coming in. Because I think part of it was I've been around Bitcoin for a while. Like I've been I've been into Bitcoin. And so I had a bit of a leg up in how I could curate things. I sort of knew who were good people to ask, and I knew good pathways to ask questions around. So, I don't really think of myself as some big expert. I just sort of know how to ask questions of the experts and to do it in such a way that I get answers that will be very educational for the listener.
Yeah. Yeah, I look at it a very similar way. Like if we all just kind of scratch our own curiosity and try to educate ourselves and ask the questions that we want answers to, there's a big chance that the people listening have similar questions, right? And this is also part of this, just accepting who you are and where you're at. Like your style of delivery and the questions you ask may not be of interest to someone a higher rung above or a rung below, but for the people that are on a similar rung, it's probably going to resonate. And so that's the kind of the faith of putting yourself out into the public sphere, whatever you're talking about, is like, I'm just going to kind of speak my truth and try to satisfy my own curiosity. And if anybody wants to tune in, that's cool. And it must be really gratifying to know that a lot of people do tune in and they value your work and they praise your work often on Twitter and stuff like that. I mean, it's aside from just the opportunity to engage in the work, I mean, the cherry on the top just must be the people that actually appreciate it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think, I really appreciate when I see a lot of people like retweeting and sharing my episodes around and things like that, because I guess I'm starting to see a lot of people who picked up a lot of their understanding just from listening through my catalog, and I think that really I guess it's gratifying to know people really like your work. So I guess that's for anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think about that when like you're speaking into the mic, or do you have a dissonance? Like, does it not register that 10,000, 100,000, whatever it is, people are actually listening to your voice and the conversation you're having?
That was a funny thing for me to get my head around. Right. For a long time, I never really got my head around that, and part of it also was before I had flown overseas recently, I had not met many of my listeners. So for me, I'm just like, I just record this episode and it just goes off into the ether and just thousands of people out there are listening, right? It didn't sort of click in my head that now, I mean, obviously at some level I understood that, but at some level you're sort of like, how weird is that? Like I literally sit down and I have a conversation with somebody, and then later, 6,000 people or more will listen to that episode. So it's sort of funny. Now I'm getting a bit more used to that. And, when you go to a Bitcoin conference and, people just know you, right, because they've heard you, that's something I'm slowly getting used to it, right?
Yeah. That must be cool, man, to show up at a place, everybody's strangers, but you somehow know each other, whether it's from Twitter, whether it's from listening to podcasts, and there's a lot of similarities, and it just must be like, hey, man, like, awesome to see you. Like I feel like we're friends.
Yeah. And it's because it's so early, right?
Right.
Imagine 5-10 years from now, it won't be like that.
Yeah.
But part of that is that's why this is such a golden time, right? Like, and part of that is maybe we're getting a little more philosophical, but it's like you got to enjoy this moment, like, because You never know when it's gone, and this thing will get big, and this kind of community feel that exists now, it may not exist then.
100%.
So
Yeah,
enjoy it while it lasts.
And like people, there's not many podcasts that just broadly discuss the internet at this point, right? There's like IoT podcasts and, whatever, but like most people aren't asking that many burning questions about the internet generally. And so, this community and the communication that's happening now will of course morph and change. So I agree, man. I think that's the right approach. Just, appreciate it and enjoy it for what it is right now. Do you have time to do some rapid fire questions?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Cool. Last question before that, though, about the kind of the state of affairs right now. You've been a bit vocal lately about crypto podcasters and people in the space that I guess, as far as you're concerned, maybe lead people in not so helpful directions. What kind of draws your ire for the people in the space that are doing that, or what is your perception of what they're doing and the negative effects?
So look, we live in an attention economy, and some people get too addicted to that, right? The likes, the retweets, the followers, whatever, right? And the influence or whatever, right? Whatever you want to call it. And my view on this is we need strong curation, right? And I guess that's quite clear because like the way I sort of run my podcast and the way I do things, that's quite clear. It annoys me when people do these sort of attention-seeking, self-aggrandizing moves because it's just BS, right? Like this Ripple guy is just not good for the industry, right? People think that this is like a crypto industry, but it's not. It's a Bitcoin industry, and the other things are like hangers-on. It's Bitcoin and people who are riding the coattails of Bitcoin. And, it frustrates me because to me, my sense of it is it's like being an engagement parasite. It's like, oh, I'm going to take all the benefit of like sucking up all this engagement because it's sort of sucking all the air out of the room and pointing it all your way. And then what does it do? It means other people have to now spend their time and effort. And you know that saying, right? It takes an order of magnitude more effort to refute bullshit than to just spout it, right? Than to just say it. And so if this guy ends up just wasting, like putting up all this, like, because you think about it this way, who profits from calling it crypto, right? There's people who profit by calling it that rather than, in my view, viewing it more like this is a Bitcoin industry, not a crypto industry. But I could be wrong. Maybe there's other people out there who really, think that there's something to that. I just, and there are other views out there, right? So some people might say, okay, fine, have Brad Garlinghouse on, but you need to get someone. You either need to be super well researched yourself, or you need to like have another guest host on there who's going to like really hammer them hard on the questions that need to be asked. So in my view, it just ends up being a bit of a time waster, right? Because some people are like, oh yeah, I would love to listen to Brad Garlinghouse on Pomp's podcast or whatever, right? Ultimately, for me, I think it's just a massive waste of time. I don't care about listening to some shitcoin CEO. Why is that valuable to me? I'm going to spend time listening to some Austrian economist lecture, or I'm going to listen to some Lightning Network lecture or Bitcoin and improve my knowledge about that. And fundamentally, look, they want to do what they want to do, but then that means I'm going to be more skeptical about the way Pomp acts in future, because if he's going to be this sort of like a weather vane and just kind of go where the attention goes, well then is he really going to have the cojones? Is he really going to have like the kind of the ticker to really stay with it in the times when it's not so good for Bitcoin, right? Yeah. That's my view on it. I think it just becomes a bit of an engagement parasite practice, and I don't think it's very productive for everyone else, because people are going to have to spend a lot of time like refuting that when they could have spent more time, doing productive things.
Yeah, I know what you're saying entirely, and I guess I oscillate between thinking about it in two ways, and ultimately I don't take action on either way of thinking, so I guess I'm somewhere frozen in the middle. But on the one hand, I think I hate to see people promoting things that will ultimately possibly potentially hurt people financially or whatever, and like, to use another example, Roger Ver's antics, with Bitcoin.com and the way he's directed people, the manner in which he's directed people to Bitcoin Cash and stuff like that. I just think like man, how many people have been burned by, just being confused by all that or being misdirected. And so I think like that's kind of a bad actor sort of behavior. On the flip side of that, and potentially in a more libertarian vein, I think the market will settle all this, So
Yeah, sure.
the market
Oh,
will.
ultimately it will.
Yeah.
I agree with you there. Like, but I think from my point of view, it's more like I'm saying individuals are part of that market.
Right.
And for me,
Right.
speaking out against what I view as kind of sketchy or, behavior that basically supports a scammer or a shitcoiner is not really a good practice. And
Right.
I'm not going to retweet Pomp, and I'm not going to like try and boost him up on this because I think he's fundamentally going the wrong direction. He's doing it in a way that builds himself at the expense of other people. And I don't like that. I think that's not a productive and constructive way to go about these things. So that's why, you might have seen some of my recent comments on Twitter and whatever. But look, ultimately, I've stopped sort of commenting heavily on that. Like, obviously, I mean, I'm commenting now because you asked me, but
Yeah.
I just think I just treat that now as that's irrelevant. I'm not going to follow that. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to spend my time doing what I think is highest value. And
Totally.
I think the highest value stuff is, the Bitcoin and Austrian economics education.
Yeah, and again, back to the market settling all this is that, people will be aware that you spoke out against something, whatever it is, and that other people supported things. And over time, the market will dictate, who was right, who was wrong, and who accrues the value for having been right or wrong, or
Right, the
loses
credibility, the reputation.
Yeah. But I did like the idea. I think Matt Odell suggested it, where he would go on, he would be a part of the interview, and it would be live streamed. Like I may look into live streaming all my stuff just because I like the idea of it being raw, real, unedited, and if there's a slip up, there's a slip up. If there's not, there's not. But I think it's a more truthful way of communicating, I think.
Yeah, no, live is cool. It's just there's a little bit more logistical around it.
Sure.
And especially when you're remote, it can be difficult if there's like technical difficulties and it's live and then everyone's like, oh, where's the guest? Da, da, da. Like, so, yeah. But I mean, definitely it can be a good thing. So
Yeah.
gotta look into it.
All right, Stephan, these are the rapid fire questions. I don't know if you've heard them before, but basically it's just one after the other. You can be as concise as you wish. You can say pass if you wish, and we'll just get right into it.
Okay, cool.
What is money?
Oh, damn.
Sorry, that's the first one.
It's the medium. It's a commonly accepted medium of exchange.
If you had to explain Bitcoin to your grandmother or someone over 80, what would you say?
It's digital hard money, and a hard money is something that's hard to make.
Primary reason for that Bitcoin is interesting or important to you?
It stops inflation and central banking.
What does the sovereign individual mean to you?
A person who takes their financial and other freedoms into their own hands.
How long after you first heard of Bitcoin did you start learning more about it and purchase it if you're comfortable saying so?
How long after I first heard of it?
Yeah.
Maybe. I honestly don't really know. It'd be like a year or something. I guess a year.
What has been your most effective method of educating people about Bitcoin in conversation or more formally? Bit of a layup for you in particular.
Well, yeah, obviously the podcast has been my main thing. So I typically give them an episode, like based on what they are interested in, I'll recommend an episode for that. So,
what movie or song is most related to Bitcoin in your opinion?
or there was a really cool parody by Zhao Tong, "Hodling for the Longest Time."
Okay. Favorite movie clip or rant of all time?
That FU Money one. You know the FU Money one?
From
There's that guy. Oh, I can't remember the actor, but basically he's talking about like having FU money.
Can Bitcoin be stopped? If so, what is Bitcoin's biggest vulnerability? If not, why not?
I don't. At this point, it's just unlikely that it's going to be stopped. So there's too many different angles for it, but I think basically most of them are that the community and Bitcoin holders will basically route around the damage.
What was your most recent aha or level up in your understanding of Bitcoin?
Oh. I was watching this chain code lightning series, seminar series. So that was a lightning residency seminar series. So that was really cool. And just there are basically understanding some of the mechanics around how commitment transactions and funding transactions and how they're revoked and the new one is replaced. It was a really cool construction. I couldn't explain it, but it was just really cool to watch the seminar and how it works.
What do you think will be Bitcoin's biggest impact on society?
Oh, dramatically reducing the size of the government.
When, if ever, do you think the first central bank will start adding Bitcoin to their reserves, and will they exist in 20 years?
Well, that might be pretty soon with Venezuela. So I would say, yeah, if it's Venezuela, a year.
And will they be around in 20 years? Central banks?
Maybe the ones who buy a lot of Bitcoin.
What is the biggest mistake you've made with Bitcoin?
So in the earlier days, when I was more of a noob, I left some, not by accident, I left some on a custodial wallet and I lost some that way. So unfortunate.
How do you feel about Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin's creator, being anonymous and the coins that he likely controls?
Oh, I totally great about him being anonymous. I think in all likelihood, Satoshi's probably dead, and so we'll never move the coins.
Why do you think he's dead?
Because I think the way he disappeared is it was too abrupt. That's my take on it anyway.
What have you learned about yourself, or how have you changed, if at all, as a result of learning about and interacting with Bitcoin?
I've deepened a lot of knowledge around Austrian economics. So I was already into Austrian economics before, but I think I just sort of went further into it. And I think that's something that I've really developed and advanced my own thinking on.
Have you ever purchased other coins? If so, are you likely to do so again in the future?
No, never touched a shitcoin.
Oh, my man. Good for you. That's a rare answer to that question. What is your most controversial or contrarian view or opinion? If not on Bitcoin, any subject is okay.
Inequality will exist, and it's going to sound bad, but ultimately more inequality can actually make us better off.
Can you put a little more meat on that?
Sure. So basically, the way in terms of capital it works is one of the big benefits of that is that you don't have to own that capital to benefit from it. And so there's two main ways in which you can benefit from a rich guy's capital. So one, his capital is overwhelmingly invested into machinery and other tools and things that drive the cost of the goods you and I buy down. The other benefit, the second one, is that it also drives the value of our labor up, all other things equal. So in that sense, we actually should recognize there is a social function and an economic benefit of inequality. Now, I know that can trigger people, but that I think is a defensible economic statement.
Yeah, I think the inevitability of it, too, is an important consideration when thinking about it. Anyhow, where are we? Ballpark estimate of Bitcoin's price in 5 years.
Oh, 100K.
Conservative. Do you have a morning routine? If so, what is it?
Morning routine, basically, not really, man. I just kind of, it really varies based on what I'm doing, so I don't really have a routine.
How do you define success?
A feeling of fulfillment.
Most impactful book you've ever read?
Ooh, The Ethics of Money Production, Guido Hulsmann.
Where or who is your go-to place to learn more about Bitcoin?
Bitcoin Twitter.
What is the one most important action that myself, anyone listening, can take to up our game in an area of your expertise? So if someone wants to improve, what's a piece of advice that you could give them today?
I would say if you want to improve your knowledge around economics, try and work your way into reading some of the higher level Austrian texts, such as Human Action, Man, Economy and State, or Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles.
What is one question you'd like to see added to this list?
Pass. I don't have any.
All right, last one, and this Robert Breedlove gave me this 2 hours ago, so you can blame him if you struggle with it. What is the meaning of life?
42.
What?
42. It's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
No, not familiar.
That's the whole joke.
I know
so
of
basically,
it.
Yeah, so basically in that book, I can't remember the whole detail of it now, but basically this computer had like calculated the meaning, like literally the meaning to life was 42, and I think they had built this supercomputer to try and figure out the real meaning of life because they weren't satisfied with that answer, but essentially the answer was 42. So
I love that answer.
That is the meaning of life.
All right, yeah. Final part. This is a word association, so I'll just blurt out a word. You tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Legend.
Government.
Horrible.
Hash rate.
Good.
The individual.
The person. I don't know. Yeah.
Security.
Vital.
Ego.
Low.
Greed.
Good.
Stacking sats.
Even better.
Fiat currency.
Horrible.
Guns.
Great.
Altcoins.
Shit.
Pizza.
Average.
Socialism.
Horrible.
Family.
Amazing.
Trump.
Average.
Future.
Better.
Libra.
Shit. Shitcoin, rather.
Gold.
Good.
And Bitcoin.
Perfect.
That's it, Stephan. That's all I got for you, man. Do you have any closing or final thoughts you wanted to share or put out there?
No, I think fundamentally you just keep improving your knowledge about Bitcoin and, keep stacking your sats and then passing it on to other people because this is how this thing grows. And, obviously check out the podcast, stephanlivera.com.
Yeah, just Google Stephan Livera. I'm sure you'll find all the destinations. But look, man, I'm a huge fan. I really appreciate the work that you put into this. I've benefited tremendously from your podcast and stuff like that. So just keep it up, man. I'm looking forward to seeing what this turns into for you.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you very much for hosting me.
All right, brother. Take care of yourself.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.